Throughout history and the centuries, there have been many men who sought absolute power across their nations. These dictators would plunge their country into war, terrorise the population and people. Some were even loved by those who lived under their regime, but some of the most notorious dictators had rather brutal and ruthless deaths and even executions, as they were finally turned upon. Benito Mussolini was a dictator of fascist Italy, and his remains were dragged out into the centre of Milan and were strung upside down high above the crowd of thousands. Such was the hatred against him at the end of the Second World War. Nicholae Ceausescu was ruthlessly shot following a revolution in Romania that saw him and his wife deposed and condemned. Saddam Hussein went to his execution kicking and screaming after he was sentenced to death by a court in Iraq. Colonel Gaddafi in Libya also was captured and was brutalised by an angry mob in his final moments. In this history documentary, we look at the executions of these men, who are remembered as some of the most ruthless dictators in history. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Nicholae Ceausescu was a member of the Romanian Communist Youth Movement in his early life. In 1936 he was imprisoned, and then 4 years later he was arrested again for his Communist Party activities. He married Elena Petrescu, a communist activist, in 1939, and whilst in prison he became the protégé of his cellmate, who became later the communist leader. He managed to escape from prison in August 1944, before the Soviet occupation, as the Second World War was raging on, and he then served as a secretary of the Union of Communist Youth. When the communists rose to power in Romania in 1947, he first headed up the Ministry of Agriculture, and he then served as a Deputy Minister of the Armed Forces, as a Major General. He then became the second most powerful person in the party's hierarchy. But following the death of the leader, Ceausescu rose to the position of the leader of the Romanian Communist Party. He then became the head of state, and he won popular support for his independent nationalistic beliefs, and he openly challenged the dominance and power of the Soviet Union over Romania. He brought to an end Romania's involvement in the Warsaw Pact alliance, and he also condemned the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact forces and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But then in 1974 he became the president. His police limited free speech, and they tolerated no internal dissent or opposition, and the regime was oppressive, and they outlawed contraception and abortion. With this, maternal mortality rates rose heavily, as women sought unsafe methods to end their pregnancies. Those who did dissent would be sent to prisons where they were tortured and treated awfully, but Ceausescu's government was heavily in debt to foreign governments. They had a number of poorly managed industrial ventures, and with this in 1982, Nicholae decided to export most of Romania's agriculture and industrial production to ease the debts. But this caused extreme poverty and shortage of food, fuel, medicines and basic necessities, to the point where the standard of living in the country heavily fell. Along with this, he appointed many members of his family, including his wife, into positions of power in the government. Elena Ceausescu in government worked as a secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she wasn't important until her husband became the General Secretary of the Communist Party. She accompanied her husband on visits abroad, including state visits to China, and she continued to get roles in senior positions inside the Communist Party. She rose to become the second most important and influential person after her husband, and she was deeply involved in the politics alongside her husband. A cult of personality emerged around the Ceausescus, with Elena being regarded as the mother of the nation, and it's believed that her desire for advancement and honours, and also vanity, was larger than her husband's ambitions. She controlled the way she appeared on camera, and was never supposed to be shown in profile, as she did have a large nose, but in March 1980 she became a first Deputy Prime Minister. But tensions in the 1980s were rising in Romania, and protests would break out. On the 16th of December 1989, the Hungarian minority in Timisoara held a protest in response to attempts by the government to evict a Hungarian pastor, Laszlo Tokes. The government claimed he was inciting hatred and wanted to remove him from his post and get rid of him. The crowd became angry and impatient and began to chant anti-communist slogans, and then the police arrived at the scene. But that evening the protests had grown and spread, and the original cause was forgotten. Some protesters attempted to burn down buildings, and the police and security forces responded with firing tear gas and using their water cannons, and the police beat up many of the rioters and arrested them. The group then began a protest march around the city, but they were confronted yet again by security forces. The next day the protests and riots resumed, and they broke into district committee buildings and threw propaganda brochures out the window, and even threw Ceausescu's writings out. The military was sent in to bring the situation to an end, but the situation was getting worse and growing larger. The army failed to establish order, and chaos erupted with gunfire being shot and fights breaking out. There were many who were injured, and cars were being set on fire, but then the tanks were sent in. There was wild shooting from Liberty Square around the city, and helicopters were overhead. Some areas looked like a war zone with blood on the streets, but Ceausescu then left to visit Iran, leaving the crushing of the revolt to his wife and his subordinates. Whilst he was away, martial law was declared and a curfew was ordered, but many defied this, including a group of 30 men who waved the Romanian flag which had removed the communist coat of arms. These were fired upon and some died, and many others were seriously injured. Elena then sent in other officials to deal with the riots, and they agreed to free the majority of arrested protesters, but when Ceausescu returned on the 20th of December, he gave a televised speech expressing his anger for the revolution. On the 21st of December he then addressed around 100,000 people to condemn the uprising. Busloads of workers arrived and were given flags and pictures of Ceausescu under duress to drown out the protesters. However, Nicholae was out of touch, and many of the crowd began to jeer and boo and whistle insults at him, and then the crowd then roared for the uprising that had begun. He became desperate, but then movement came from the outskirts of the crowd, as did the sound of gunshots, fireworks or bombs, and chaos broke out. The crowd tried to disperse, and there was news that security forces were firing on the crowd as the revolution was unfolding. The speech was broadcast around the nation, and Ceausescu and his wife panicked and were hustled back into the building. The crowd turned into a riot, chanting "Down with the dictator" and "Death to the criminal," and as time went on many more people took to the streets. Anti-terrorist special squads were brought in, and soon the crowd was being shot at by the army from a number of buildings. There were many casualties as victims were shot, clubbed to death and stabbed by government forces. Some were even run over, as one APC drove over the crowd crushing people. Water cannons were turned on, and then police continued to batter and beat everyone they saw, and intense firing and shooting continued into the night. In the early hours of the 22nd of December, the Ceausescus made the decision to wait until the early morning to flee the city. Before 7 a.m, Elena heard that there were large amounts of workers heading for the city of Bucharest to join in with the protests. Martial law was brought back in, and there was a ban on large groups. However, hundreds of thousands were gathering in central Bucharest. At 9:30, Vasile Milei, the Minister of Defence, died under suspicious circumstances, and many believed he hesitated to follow the orders given to him by Ceausescu to fire on the demonstrators. The new Minister of Defence, Victor Stanculescu, would later refuse to fire on them, which played a pivotal role in the overthrow of the government. He would later claim, "I had the prospect of two execution squads, Ceausescu's and the revolutionary one." However, Nicholae and Elena then headed for the roof of the building they were inside of, and they were to be airlifted off a roof. But a group of protesters made their way into the building and overpowered the bodyguards before heading to the balcony. They were meters from Ceausescu, and the lift's electricity failed before it got to the top. The personal pilot of the president was given instructions to airlift them out of there, but it became impossible to land where he wanted. He later said, "Then Stilica, the co-pilot, came to me and said that there were demonstrators coming to the terrace. Then the Ceausescus came out, both practically carried by their bodyguards. They looked as if they were fainting. They were white with terror. Maniu Manescu and Emil Bobu were running behind them. Manescu and Bobu and another Securite officer scrambled to the 4 seats at the back as I pulled Ceausescu in. I saw the demonstrators running across the terrace. There wasn't enough space. Elena Ceausescu and I squeezed in between chairs and the doors. We were only supposed to carry 4 passengers, and we had 6. They left for Snagov, and when they arrived, Matalan's unit commander said, 'There has been a revolution. You are on your own. Good luck.' Matulan told the Ceausescus he could do no more. The security detail then tried to flag down a car, and they were picked up by a doctor who did not really want to help. He then faked car problems and they were picked up by another driver, but they were then arrested by local police and were transported to a garrison military compound and held captive until they were placed on trial. The trial of Nicholae and Elena Ceausescu was rather brief and it lasted around an hour. They would defend themselves and were accused of genocide with over 60,000 victims, subversion of state power by organising armed action against the people, offensive destruction of public property by destroying and damaging buildings, undermining the national economy, and trying to flee Romania, using over $1 billion deposited in foreign banks. It was in a sense a show trial, as they were convicted of all charges and were condemned to death. They did not have the chance to choose their own lawyers, and Nicholae would question the authenticity of the court. But regardless of this, the Ceausescus were to be executed for their crimes, and this was seen as a violent and bloody end to the Romanian dictatorship. Just days after the revolution had broken out, they were dead. Elena and Nicholae were executed at 4 p.m. on a military base outside of Bucharest on Christmas Day 1989. The execution was performed by a firing squad which was made up of paratroop soldiers. Hundreds, it's believed, volunteered to take the lives of the dictator and his wife, and Nicholae Ceausescu would state, before that, "We could have been shot without having this masquerade." The Ceausescu's hands were tied by 4 soldiers before the execution. Before the sentence was carried out, Elena screamed, "You sons of dogs," while she was led outside and lined up against a wall, and this wall was against the side of the barrack building. Whilst this was happening, Nicholae sung the Internationale, and as the pair were stood against the wall, the firing squad then began firing quickly. The execution was hastily arranged, and the executioners were trigger happy, to the point where the television crew, which was there to capture the death sentence, was not ready. In fact, they only managed to capture the last rounds of shots fired from the guns. A retired captain would later tell newspapers that he believed the shots from his rifle were the ones responsible for the deaths of the Ceausescus, because of the 3 soldiers assigned to fire, he was the only one who remembered to switch his Kalashnikov rifle to fire fully automatic. Because of this, at least one of the members of the group hesitated as he fired, and in 1990 it was found that around 120 bullets were lodged inside the bodies of Elena and Nicholae Ceausescu. The execution was deemed to have been carried out quickly, as they were worried that loyalists would try to rescue them. But following the execution, their bodies were covered in canvas, and they were flown to Bucharest and then interred inside a cemetery. The Ceausescus were the final people to be executed in Romania before the abolition of capital punishment on the 7th of January 1990, and their death brought a bloody end to their decades of power over Romania. Between July and December 2003, Task Force 121 conducted 12 raids to find Saddam Hussein, which were unsuccessful, and 600 other operations were carried out against other targets. These were then interrogated, and on the 1st of December 2003, a former driver of Saddam's mentioned Mohammed Ibrahim Omar al-Muslit as Saddam's right-hand man. He was known as a Fat Man, and over the next 2 weeks, 40 members of his family were interrogated to find out where he was. But then on the 12th of December, a raid on a house in Baghdad captured Omar. He then revealed the location where Saddam could be found, and further intelligence was gathered that pinpointed Saddam Hussein's location to a remote farm location south of Tikrit. The operation to snatch Saddam, Operation Red Dawn, was launched, and 2 site names, Wolverine 1 and Wolverine 2, were to be investigated. There were around 600 soldiers involved in the mission, including even cavalry and artillery. The forces at first cleared the 2 objectives, but Saddam could not be found. But as the soldiers were finishing up their investigation, one of them kicked a piece of flooring to the side. In doing this, he exposed a spider hole and a tiny hole in the ground, and he was ready to throw a grenade inside of it, in case it led to a tunnel system containing hostile forces. But as he was about to do this, Saddam Hussein appeared, and then the soldier struck him with the butt of his M4 carbine and disarmed Saddam of his Glock pistol. He offered no resistance and surrendered, and was then taken to the mission support site before he was transferred to Baghdad and was held in custody at the airport. Along with his pistol, he had an AK-47 with him and roughly $750,000. After this, Saddam was then placed on trial. His first hearing took place on the 1st of July 2004, and in this he stated, "This is all theatre, the real criminal is Bush." He defended Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait, referring to the people as dogs, who were trying to reduce the women of Iraq into nothing. His language was crude and he did not hold back, but Saddam was then charged with a number of different charges the following year. He was accused of killing 148 Shiites from Dajjal, following a failed assassination attempt. He questioned the legitimacy of the court and said, "Neither do I recognise the body that has designated and authorised you, nor the aggression, because all that has been built on false basis is false." Saddam claimed he was the president of Iraq, and there were many incidents throughout his trial where he showed defiance against the authority of the courtroom. He told them to go to hell at one point, and then even refused to enter the courtroom and complained about his imprisonment, and said that his American captors tortured him, saying, "I've been beaten on every place of my body, and the signs are all over my body." But on the 5th of November 2006, Saddam Hussein was sentenced to death by hanging for the killing of 148 Shiites. When the verdict was announced, Saddam screamed, "Long live the people! Long live the Arab nation! Down with the spies! God is great!" It was believed that the appeals would go on for years, but on the 26th of December 2006, Saddam's appeal was rejected and the death sentence was instated. No further appeals were allowed, and it was said that Saddam must be executed within 30 days of that date. The decision had to be signed off by the Iraqi president, but could not be commuted. Saddam requested to be executed by firing squad instead of hanging, and he claimed that it was lawful as a military execution, and he wanted to be shot as a soldier and as the commander-in-chief of the Iraqi military. This was denied, and 2 days before his execution a letter was published, in which he asked the Iraqi people to unite and to not hate the people of the countries that invaded Iraq, but instead hate those at the top of these nations who ordered the invasions and made the decisions. He claimed he was ready to die as a martyr. In the final hours before his execution, he had a final meal of chicken and rice, and also had a cup of hot water with honey. The execution was scheduled to take place at 6 a.m. local time, and it took place at the joint Iraqi-American military base of Camp Justice in Qasemain in Baghdad. Saddam was to be executed alone, away from the eyes of his co-defendants. It was said that the Americans wanted to delay the execution by 15 days, because they weren't keen on having him executed right away. The day before the execution, the Prime Minister's office provided all the documents they asked for, and the Americans changed their mind when they saw the Prime Minister being very insistent. It was a case of finalising details. It was said that the US had no direct involvement in Saddam's execution after he was handed over to the Iraqi government. There were reports that before his execution, Saddam was submissive, and that he carried the Quran. A witness disagreed with this though, as it was said Saddam kept shouting, "Down with the invaders," as he entered the chamber, and when he was asked if he had any fear or remorse, it was said he replied with, "No, I'm a militant. I have no fear for myself. I've spent my life in jihad fighting aggression. Anyone who takes this route should be not afraid." He remained defiant, even as a noose and rope was placed around his neck. After the rope was secured, he shouted, "Do you consider this bravery?" As he was stood there, a version of an Islamic prayer was recited, and one witness said to Saddam, "Go to hell." He then replied with, "The hell that is Iraq." Another masked guard said, "You have destroyed us, you have killed us, you made us live in destitution." And Saddam replied with, "I have saved you from destitution and misery, and destroyed your enemies, the Persians and Americans." But then the deputy prosecutor tried to bring proceedings to a calm, saying, "Please stop, this man is facing an execution." He then began to recite the Shahada twice, and near to the end of the second time, the trapdoor sprang open, and instantly Saddam Hussein was left hanging, and he was killed. There was a loud crack as he plunged through the trapdoor, and with this his neck was broken. After he was left hanging for some minutes, the doctor then approached his body and listened to a heartbeat, and then declared that Saddam Hussein was dead, and was confirmed dead at 6:03 a.m. There were rumours after his death that Saddam's corpse was stabbed a number of times, but this was disputed, and other witnesses claimed this did not happen. His body was then buried in his birthplace near to his family members, and the bodies of his two sons, Uday and Qasem, at 4 a.m. on the 31st of December 2006. The tomb in which his body was buried was later destroyed, and it was said his body was removed by a Sunni tribal group before the tomb was destroyed. There was some criticism regarding Saddam Hussein's death sentence, as some believed it was unjust and others considered that he was a martyr. There was also criticism about the trial he had, and that this had been unfair. But ultimately Saddam Hussein was a man who led a repressive regime in Iraq and was responsible for the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people. The circumstances of the invasion of Iraq are still debated today, as it's considered that hundreds of innocent servicemen and women lost their lives in an invasion that had little justification. The issues with Iraq were not solved with Saddam's execution, and they continued for a number of years. Gaddafi was born in a tent in the Libyan desert, and no one would have predicted how he rose to prominence. At university he was a talented student, and then he began to plot to overthrow the Libyan monarchy. He graduated from the Libyan Military Academy in 1965, then rose through different promotions, and he had a goal in mind to overthrow the government and to stage a military coup. On the 1st of September 1969 he seized control of the government in the military coup that deposed the king Idris I. He became the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and chairman of the new governing body in the country, the Revolutionary Command Council. He removed the US and other countries from military bases in the country the following year, and expelled large amounts of people from Libya, and then he nationalised all foreign-owned petroleum assets in the land. In accordance with his religious beliefs, he also banned alcohol and gambling, and was opposed to negotiations with Israel. He became a tough negotiator, and his government were involved in a number of coup attempts in Sudan and Egypt, and they were meddling in the long civil war in Chad. Gaddafi became known for being unpredictable and erratic, and his government financed a number of groups with revolutionary ideas, including even the IRA in Northern Ireland. Libyan spies would assassinate opponents and dissidents abroad, and his government were involved in a number of terrorist incidents inside of Europe. He came into conflict with the American government, and in April 1986, a force of British-based American warplanes bombed sites in Libya, and even killed and wounded some of Gaddafi's children. But they missed a key target. As mentioned, he was involved in the Lockerbie bombing over Scotland, which destroyed a civilian aircraft, killing 270 people on board. He faced sanctions for this and further isolation, but then later as the 21st century came around, Libya announced it would drop its unconventional weapons programme, and many of the sanctions were then lifted. Gaddafi was trying to rehabilitate his image, and he was then elected the chairman of the African Union in February 2009. But in February 2011, anti-government demonstrations forced presidents from power in neighbouring Tunisia and Egypt. Then anti-Gaddafi demonstrations broke out in Benghazi. Protests then spread throughout Libya, and Gaddafi's regime tried to brutally put them down. He ordered direct fire of live ammunition at protesters, and they were attacked by fighter jets and helicopter gunships, and this was condemned all around the world. The violent tactics showed that he had not changed, and a number of ministers defected and then supported the uprising. On the 22nd of February he appeared on television and gave a defiant speech refusing to step down, and he called the protesters traitors. But his leadership seemed weak, and by the end of February the protesters had taken large parts of land, including they managed to encircle Tripoli. Gaddafi remained in control but was living in isolation, and he insisted he was still well loved, and he believed that Al-Qaeda were behind the opposition. Further pressure called for him to step down, then the UN stepped in, imposing a travel ban and arms embargo on him, and they freezed his family's assets. In some areas his forces did regain lands, but then the UN Security Council voted on the 17th of March to take military action in the country to protect civilians. Because of this, NATO launched an air campaign and significantly damaged Gaddafi's forces, but this eventually led to a stalemate. Further high-profile defections occurred, and Gaddafi continued to refuse to step down. On the 30th of April, a NATO airstrike killed his youngest son and 3 of his grandchildren, but Gaddafi was in the house at the time of the attack. Whilst this was also happening, war crimes charges were being drawn up against his regime, and there were arrest warrants issued for him along with his son and the intelligence chief. A lot of these charges and accusations revolved around the orders to fire on civilian protesters. But then in August 2011, Tripoli would fall as rebel fighters took control of large areas, and they then captured his headquarters and ransacked the compound. Gaddafi's whereabouts were unknown, and rumours were that he was with heavily armed loyalists in Sirte. He refused to leave and flee or give over power, but then the last loyalist district of Sirte fell and he decided to flee. At 8:30 on the 20th of October 2011, the loyalists tried to escape in a convoy of 75 vehicles, and the fast-moving convoy with Gaddafi in it was spotted, and NATO intercepted a call made by the leader. Then NATO fired on 21 of the vehicles, destroying one, and an American Predator drone fired, and then French fighter jets continued the bombing. They killed dozens of loyalists, and after the first strike the convoy split up, and rebel units on the ground also attacked. NATO claimed they did not know Gaddafi was in the convoy, and that they were not involved in the capture. Following the airstrike which destroyed the vehicle in front of Gaddafi's car, he and his son took shelter in a nearby house, which was then shelled. Muttasim, his son, then with 20 fighters went on the lookout for undamaged cars, and it was said the group belly-crawled to a sand berm, looking for a way to escape. One of the guards threw a grenade, and then it hit a concrete wall and fell in front of Gaddafi, and a guard then picked it up and it exploded, killing 2 people. But it was time to hide for the former leader, and he hid out in a large drainage pipe with a number of his bodyguards. A nearby group opened fire, and they wounded Gaddafi in the leg and back, and there were rumours that one of his own bodyguards shot him to avoid being captured, and being tortured, being taken alive. However, he was then ordered out of the drain, and he got out slowly, and he was then dragged up to his feet. A UN report claimed there was a different story of events, as he'd been wounded by fragments of the grenade, and this shredded his flak jacket. Apparently he was on the floor dazed and in shock, and bleeding from the head, and then one of his groups surrendered. But after his capture he was killed. Different reports of this exist. One said that he said, "Please don't shoot," before he was shot by rebel fighters. He was questioned before and denied any involvement, and one fighter ordered him to stand up, and he could not do so. In one video he said, "God forbids this, and do you know right from wrong?" when his captors shouted at him. He was also seen lying on the front of a car, and it said no official execution order was given to execute Gaddafi. It was also said they captured him alive, and whilst he was taken away, they beat him and killed him. Another account said, when the car was moving, it was caught in crossfire between the revolutionaries and Gaddafi's forces, in which he was hit by a bullet in the head. What is certain, though, is that he was set upon by Misrata fighters, who wounded him with a bayonet in the backside, and then began to pummel him with kicks and fists. It's believed that he was also shot. But by the time he was placed in an ambulance, his body was lifeless, and it's believed he had been killed at this moment. Many people posed for photographs with his remains, and he was stripped and also verbally abused. The doctor's official examination said he had been shot in the head and also the abdomen. But then his body was placed on public display to allow the people of Libya to see their former dictator dead. His body was placed in an emptied public freezer in Misrata, and thousands travelled to see it. One said that he had a number of gunshot wounds which had residue on them, showing he had been shot dead at close range. His body was also displayed alongside his son's, then the remains were passed over to his family, and they were buried in a secret location. Gaddafi's death was one of the most shocking of the 21st century, and much of his final ordeal was captured on mobile phones, and the world's media then showed his downfall. He was a man who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most shocking and violent dictators of the 20th century, and in the aftermath of his death, a number of his supporters wounded and tortured one of the men who captured him. They tortured this man for days, and this showed the anger that many had towards his killing, especially those who remained loyal to him. Gaddafi was a man who was a violent and oppressive dictator, whose stronghold over Libya lasted for decades.
Benito Mussolini had been Italy's fascist dictator since 1925, but he had been Prime Minister for years before. But his involvement in the Second World War caused a lot of controversy, and in July 1943, following the Allied invasion of Sicily, Mussolini was deposed and arrested. But then during the Gran Sasso raid he was freed, and Hitler installed him as the leader of the Italian Social Republic, a northern Italy German puppet state. But the Allies then continued to fight north, and they took Rome and Florence. But then Mussolini on the 18th of April 1945 left Garganano, a village near to Salo, where he had been living. He moved his government to Milan and based himself there. He was preparing for defeat, and he hoped that the Archbishop of Milan would help him negotiate peace with the partisans and the Allies. But after a week the army were crumbling, and Mussolini then debated making a last stand in the Italian Alps, fleeing to Switzerland, or trying to negotiate a peaceful handover with the partisans. But at this time there were orders issued against fascist politicians, and they were to be executed for their betrayal of Italy. The partisans decreed members of the fascist government of fascism, who were guilty of suppressing constitutional guarantees, destroying popular liberties, creating the fascist regime, compromising and betraying the fate of the country, and leading it to the present catastrophe, are to be punished with the penalty of death, and in less serious instances, life imprisonment. But Mussolini tried to negotiate peacefully, and this did not work, and he then fled Milan. He went towards Lake Como, and it was not known if he was trying to get to the Swiss border. He was joined by his mistress Clara Petacci, and they made a number of attempts to cross the border. But then on the 27th of April 1945, he joined a Luftwaffe convoy who were retreating to Germany. But then a group of local communist partisans attacked the convoy, which carried Mussolini and Petacci near to the village of Dongo. The convoy stopped, and there were other fascist leaders in there, but to begin with Mussolini was not recognised. They had the Germans hand over the Italians, but found slumped over was Mussolini. It was said his face was like wax in his glassy stare, but somehow blind. I read utter exhaustion, but not fear. Mussolini seemed completely lacking in will, spiritually dead. The partisans arrested Mussolini, and he was taken to Dongo, and spent the evening in local barracks, and he was reunited with his mistress. There was fighting in the area, and there was a worry that the pair would be freed, and because of this they were taken to a safe house, a farmhouse belonging to a local peasant family. Mussolini's capture was then announced on the radio that evening, and the announcement said, "The head of this association of delinquents, Mussolini, while yellow with rancour and fear, and trying to cross the Swiss frontier, has been arrested. He must be handed over to a tribunal of the people, so it can judge him quickly. We want this, even though we think an execution platoon is too much of an honour for this man. He would deserve to be killed like a mangy dog." There were a number of different accounts about who ordered the execution of Mussolini. The Secretary General of the Communist Party claimed he had done so, but then it was claimed that the others did this. A senior communist, Luigi Longo, said the order came from the General Command of the partisan military units, and that the decision to execute him was made in the evening following his capture. Longo instructed a communist partisan of the General Command, Walter Ordizio, to be the one who was sent to execute Mussolini, and he was told to go and shoot him, and Ordizio took with him another partisan, Aldo Lampredi. There were a number of accounts as to how Mussolini was executed, but the executioners left in the morning of the 28th of April 1945 to carry out the orders, and they got to Dongo, and Ordizio was driven to the farmhouse to collect Mussolini and Petacci. After they were picked up, the executioners drove 20 kilometres south, and the truck pulled up at the entrance of the Villa Belmont on a narrow road. Mussolini and Petacci were told and ordered to get out of the car and to stand by the villa's walls. Ordizio then, at 4:10 p.m, shot Mussolini and Petacci with his machine gun that he had borrowed, as his own gun had jammed. It was said Mussolini was cowardly in his final moments, and then he began to become upset, telling the executioner to aim at my heart when the execution order was given. There are differing accounts as to the events of his execution, and Ordizio said there had been a war tribunal called, which condemned the pair to death. However, following the executions, the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci and other executed fascists were taken to Milan. When they got to the city they were dumped on the ground of the Piazza Loretta, a square near to the railway station. 15 partisans had been shot there in August 1944, and the bodies of Mussolini and Petacci were left, and then by 9 a.m. a huge crowd had gathered. The bodies were then beaten, spat at and were desecrated and kicked, to the point where Mussolini was so badly disfigured that he was not recognisable. Then the bodies were hanged by their feet from the metal framework of a half-built service station, and they were hanged upside down as shame. People continued to throw things, but the sight of Mussolini's remains above the crowd were haunting and shocking. But then at 2 p.m. on the 29th of April, the Americans came to the square and they ordered the bodies to be cut down, and they were then taken to a morgue in Milan for autopsy. It was confirmed that Mussolini had been shot and killed by a number of bullets, either 7 or 9 bullets. 4 were said to have been near the heart and were considered the cause of death. However, one of the biggest impacts of Mussolini's death was not inside of Italy, but it was inside of a bunker in Berlin. Hitler found out about Mussolini's execution and also the subsequent display of his remains in Milan. With this, he decided that he was to end his own life and that preparations would be made to ensure that his body did not fall into the hands of his enemies, and also this was said of Eva Braun, his wife's remains. It was said that, if Hitler did learn the full gory tale of Mussolini's death, it could have done no more than confirm his anxiety to take his own life before it was too late, and to prevent his body from being seized by his enemies. Mussolini would be later reinterred inside the Mussolini family crypt in 1957, after his remains had been dug up and were actually stolen by fascists. On the anniversary of his death, many fascists make a pilgrimage to his tomb, and thousands of people attend the graveside. Mussolini was a man who stuck with his close friend Hitler to take Italy into the Second World War, and ultimately their involvement in the war was not successful at all. He was a fascist who seized control of Italy decades before the war, and there were many people who looked at him, including Hitler, as an idol. However, he met his brutal end at the side of a road near to Lake Como, with an executioner firing at close range, killing him and his mistress, before their remains were shown in front of a huge crowd in Milan.